I'm really glad that we can take some time and talk about some big ideas about life, especially life with God, walking with Jesus, and being a disciple of Christ. And as we explore some of these themes, I'm hopeful that this will make a big difference in bringing depth and texture and wholeness and completeness to your own personal spiritual journey and the life of your church or your small group or your community. That's my greatest desire. So I'm so thankful that you've been willing to take some time to walk with me in exploring some of these themes. And this is the first in a very brief series that I'd like to talk with you about regarding the whole idea of holiness. It's a big subject, and it's often one, it's kind of like an eel. You grab onto it and it slips out. We don't really capture a real understanding of the nature of holiness. And so I understand that it's very elusive at best. We try our very best to get our minds around the idea of holiness, but sometimes it's just more difficult. And often our referent points are the points that we look to help us understand really are focusing in on one narrow dimension of holiness. And I'd like to try to open it up like a flower for you and understand the beauty, the fullness. And frankly, we will never fully understand the nature of holiness, but I'd like to at least take a little time with you to help that flower unfold a bit more, even in your own life. So as we begin this first session, I want to talk with you about what is holiness, kind of like a definition. Now, again, I just got through saying that we really can't define what holiness is, and I'll explain that in a moment. Nevertheless, we can try to lean into it, to capture some of the essence of it. And as I talk about the definition of holiness, we begin by realizing this is perhaps one of the most misunderstood themes of the Bible. It's one of the most misunderstood themes of Christian living because we have applied to the idea of holiness sets of behaviors and expectations and theological truths and doctrinal presuppositions and propositions and limitations and all of that. And in the course of doing that, we have really come to a lack of ability to be able to fully comprehend. And then we add to that how God treats holiness in the Bible, and we realize that he's talking about holiness in a lot of different applications, which also tends to confuse us because we don't see God saying this is holiness. Sometimes in the Bible, God says, make that place holy. Other times, make that thing holy. Sometimes he says, I want you to be holy. And other times he says, sanctify yourselves, make yourselves holy. And so often we read in the Bible the term holy and its derivatives and the process of becoming holy. We read holy and holiness and sanctify and sanctification. We see all of those words that are all related to the theme of holiness throughout Scripture. And so we see different times in the Bible when God is instructing us and the people of Israel to do something that is holy, or addressing a theme, or a location, or a person, or a people. And it just introduces a level of complexity in our own thinking that causes us not to fully comprehend the true depths, texture, nature, spread, breadth of the idea of holiness. So it's often misunderstood because in our human minds, in our human tendencies, we want to box something up. We want to put it in a nice little formula, and we want to make it something that we can get our heads around. Now, there's a reason why we can't fully understand holiness, because we can't get our minds around it, because we're incapable of it, because it transcends our human ability to do so. So if you're expecting to try to take the idea of holiness and holy living for your own personal life and reduce it to a nice formula or a definition, I'm sorry to tell you that you're not going to be able to do that. And if you do, and if you come to a point where you feel like successfully you have defined it or you embody it, that's the point where you have fully misunderstood the nature of holiness itself, because it is way beyond our capacity to put in a box or even to define definitively in a formula. So let's unpack this whole idea of holiness. We have often, as I just said, we have often tended to bring holiness into the structures and ideas that we as humans can understand. And the best way we do that is to say, here's a big idea, here's a big spiritual principle, and I see how that's changed my heart and how that has changed my behavior. So in order to perpetuate holy living, I am going to replicate this particular behavior, you see. And that's what happened actually over the last 200 years in even the movement in which many of our churches, the fastest growing segments of the church worldwide, have been birthed in this holiness stream, this holiness movement. Often it was fueled by people who were passionate. They had a fire in their belly, if you will, and it consumed them and it transformed their lives. And because of that internal transformation, it changed the activity of their hand. It changed their behavior. See, something that's inside us comes out of us and it changes our behavior. Well, in order to perpetuate that and to pass it on to their children and grandchildren and to subsequent generations, often what people did was they said, okay, this is living the holy life, so I'm going to write down what that looks like. And it looks like this and this and this and this. So then the conclusion of the next generations was that really living the holy life is this, 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 and this, these behaviors. So we came to understand that holy living was a set of behaviors, but what we forgot was it came from a fire in the soul that transformed the nature and had a natural effect of changing behaviors. So we got the behaviors without the fire in the soul, so to speak. And then that went to next generations and next generations. Pretty soon now, those behaviors became the definition of holy living. And not only that, but then we began to take those behaviors and say to other people, you need to be holy, and being holy means you need to live like this, 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 and this. Well, we know that Paul calls that legalism in the book of Galatians, right? And so we've come to a point in the previous century where we've understood the idea of living the holy life as being a list of behaviors and a pattern of doctrine, but we forgot that it really is a fire that consumes and transforms the soul. Those behaviors are only the evidence of something inside. Well, that's when many of us, many of our churches, many of our movements around the world struggled with legalism. And in these days, God is renewing this passionate understanding for His holy nature, this consuming fire that changes the soul and then affects behavior. So legalism has become often associated with the idea of holiness. Matter of fact, it's gotten to the point where many people just, when they hear the word holy living or holiness, they just sort of discard it. They just sort of, I don't understand that, so I'm not going to mess with that. That's just a bunch of legalistic, fanatic people who don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, or whatever other phrases you may have come up with. And they live according to a certain holiness code that is a contemporary holiness code. And we know there was one in the Old Testament, but it was designed to get the heart transformed, you see. Matter of fact, the idea of holiness today often has been reduced to simply being the precursor to a swear word. I mean, you hear it all the time, even in secular environments and in the corporate world and in the work sites and all of that. Holy, and then something that follows it, right? So we've almost reduced holiness because we haven't been able to get our minds around it. We haven't been able to understand it completely. We've reduced it to a list of behaviors that have become legalistic, and we've often imposed that on others. And frankly, that's not a good representation of God nor of God's holiness. So that's why understanding what holiness is really important. Now, again, we can understand what holiness is not. It is not a list of behaviors. It is not merely a doctrine, right? It is something far more than that. Of all of the themes in the Bible that we read about, this is unique unto itself, because most of the themes in the Bible are things that God does to us or for us. Like, for example, he forgives us of our sins, or he gives us grace that is sufficient for all of our needs, or he calls us to be faithful and he helps us. He gives us courage. He gives us strength. He gives us empowerment. You know, he provides a lot of these things to us or does things for us. Holiness is not something that God does to us or for us. Holiness, in its very root, is simply a description of the nature of God. It's not about what he does, it's about who God is. So once we start thinking about this idea of holiness as a descriptor of God, now that changes everything, because it's not a doctrine that we provide intellectual assent to. It's not a behavior that we comply with. It is the nature of God's own self. He is holy. Now, we are called to be holy as God is holy. We know that, and we read that in the Old and the New Testaments. We are called to be holy as God is holy. But once we understand that holiness is not a doctrine and it's not a behavior, those are simply evidences of holiness, now we begin to start get our minds around what holiness is. It is the nature of God. That's all holiness is. It is God's very nature. So then you say, how then am I supposed to be able to be holy as God is holy? How am I supposed to be able to follow the command of holiness? Well, because it's not a doctrine, because it's not a list of behaviors, there's nothing that you can do. There's no act of your will that will make you holier. There's nothing that you can do that will cause you to be holy as God is holy. Let me just start with this and tell you that because holiness is the nature of God, the singular act of your will in walking in the way of holiness, the singular act of your will is surrender. Complete, abject surrender. Not to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, to try harder and do more, to live up to those behavioral patterns, not to try more intellectually to give assent to a theological or doctrinal proposition. The singular act of your will in walking in the way of holiness is surrender. Surrender to what? Surrender to the nature of God in you. As you surrender your will, your nature, your agenda, everything that you cling to, as you open your hand and you simply lift your eyes and you say, God, I am incapable. I am deficient. Oh God, I surrender myself to you. The nature of God now begins to have greater and greater access. The evidence of God's nature in you increases in greater and greater measure. And as God begins to increase in you, suddenly God's nature begins to become more evidenced in you. And what is the nature of God? God is holy. So as God's nature is increasingly permeating the crevices of your being, you will be holy as God is holy. Not because you've tried harder, not because you've done better, not because you're such a good intellectual, and not because by your act of the will you can somehow make it happen. That's selfishness. That's arrogance. But because you have surrendered to the influence of God in you, and because God is holy, you now begin to be holy. Now, we are incapable of defining all of the nuances of that holiness because it is a descriptor of God, and God is beyond our ways, right? And so often that holiness will find expression in your life in different ways than your neighbor or in this church differently than this church. But we see the telltale signs where we see the nature that is transformed and the priorities that are realigned. And we begin to recognize the image of God in one another. That's why the best way to really capture the essence of holiness is that it is Christ-likeness. In him, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in bodily form. So Christ-likeness coming out of us is the holy nature of God being visible. Holiness is the nature of God in you as you surrender daily to God's influence in your life. May God bless you on the way of holy living.